Good morning, and welcome to Fridays with Frank, a lecture series sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Gary Wensky, and I am the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. The Frank Church Institute was established to honor the achievements and to carry forward the principles of Senator Frank Church. He delivered the first lecture on War or Peace, the American Role at Boise State University in 1982. Given today's challenges to democracies around the world, conversations like these are even more important. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, our thanks to Oppenheimer Companies, C. Frederick Cornforth, and Community Development, Inc. for underwriting this series on how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century. Today's guest, Steven Feldstein, held the Frank and Bethine Church Chair for Public Affairs at Boise State University from 2017 to 2020. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on issues of democracy, technology, human rights, and U.S. foreign policy. Previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the U.S. Department of State. He also served as the Director of Policy at the U.S. Agency for International Development and as a counsel to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. His new book, entitled The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. Also joining the discussion is Chase Johnson, who served in the Peace Corps, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and the Defense Department. Let's begin with Chase Johnson.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, and I'm thrilled to be here today for what should be a really prescient discussion. For our audience, if you have a question for Steven, please put it in the comments and I will try and get to as many as we can. I'd also like to take this opportunity to invite you to follow us on whatever platform you may be watching. And especially if you can, please subscribe to our YouTube page. This will help us get these kind of discussions out to more people who can enjoy them. Also, if you do so, you will have a chance to win a copy of Steven's new book, The Rise of Digital Repression. Okay, so on to business. Global affairs can sometimes feel like Groundhog Day. Perennial problems and opportunities tend to pop up over and over again. Climate change, ending poverty, those types of things. But it's rare when a whole new dynamic emerges, and that is exactly what Steven has explored in this new book. Emerging technology has made our lives easier. So has it increased the opportunities among bad actors. Dictators have new means to spy on and repress dissent. Malign actors like terrorist organizations now have global technology or global communications platforms and networks to recruit and operate. And we, the consumer, are often the victim, whether it be through monopolistic lack of choice or a repressive regime that uses this technology to crush dissent. So, Steven, I'll bring you on here. It's good to see you again, and we miss you at the Institute, but it's great to see you out doing these great things. So let me begin with this. So can you tell our audience what digital repression is, but also can you tell us what it isn't? Because I've seen a very diverse discussion politically, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's really great to participate in my first Fridays with Frank series. So it's really nice, and it's also nice. It's a bit of a homecoming. I was mentioning to Gary and Chase. Unfortunately, we're still not quite at a point where we're doing these things in person. So you get the benefit of seeing each of us in our own particular individual houses. But soon we'll get there, hopefully by the fall. And in the meantime, this is a nice way for all of us to connect. And I also just want to mention that when it came to the writing of this book and really having the research space and time to put it together and to, most importantly, to really try out a lot of the ideas in classes that I taught at Boise State University, that was something that I don't know if this book would have been possible without that support, without the resources afforded by being the chair of the Frank Church Institute and being affiliated with Boise State University. So it's really a great pleasure for me to come back to the university community and to talk a little bit about what the actual book is now that we're sort of at this point. So Chase, in answer to your question, what is digital repression? How do you think about it? Why does it matter? What does it represent? What does it not represent? Broadly speaking, digital repression is a use of information and communications technology by state actors to deter, coerce, intimidate individuals or groups who otherwise would not conform to the objectives of the state. And it really encompasses kind of a number of different tactics and techniques. I tend to break them down into 5 for purposes of the book. So surveillance techniques, everything from mass surveillance that you would find in China to more targeted spyware that different governments like Saudi Arabia's use to penetrate the communications of journalists. Censorship also can be everything from systemic filtering and blocking that you would see behind China's Great Firewall to more specific efforts by governments like India to censor content on Twitter or order the takedown of particular content that is critical of the government. So pretty wide range. Third is disinformation. And this is really one of the interesting categories, because we oftentimes think of disinformation as sort of falsehoods spread by extreme groups and others with a particular conspiracy agenda at play. Think QAnon, think some of the extreme conservative groups that have come out as a result of the elections and what we've been through in the last couple months domestically. But it also is a very important tool for governments to use as a means to both put out pro-government propaganda as well as to suppress legitimate voices of criticism and dissent in their countries. And so one of the chapters in my book profiles the Philippines as a case in point. Fourth is internet shutdowns, a basic means for governments to cut connectivity in the face of escalating protests or to throttle the ability of internet service providers to provide connectivity so that people can use and access different web platforms. And then finally is the targeted persecution of online users. So specifically governments looking to arrest, persecute, jail people with a very significant online presence who they view as threats to the regime. And that kind of lays out the kind of broader ecosystem. But, kind of within that, there are a lot of categories that are kind of in and out. Is this repression? Is this something new? Is it a continuation of political repression? So there's a lot of nuances to it. And that's what kind of makes it, I think, both very challenging as a topic and also incredibly rich and interesting.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. What I've seen, especially in our relatively cushy lives here in the States, is oftentimes we don't know what is happening to us vis-a-vis our relationship with technology. But you went out to the hot spots for this dynamic around the world to write this book. So what was that like for you personally to kind of be in the center of all this?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's really a good kind of way to think about how this kind of works. So I'll say a few things on that. So first of all, I thought very carefully about what kind of countries I wanted to include as case studies in the book. And what I was really looking for were sort of a diversity of experiences. So, I wanted to go to a country that was more authoritarian in nature, which is, Thailand is really kind of illustrative of that. I wanted to go to a weak democracy and see how how technology and the use of repression contrasted. So the Philippines was another place I picked. And then I wanted to go to a place that was undergoing kind of a big transition, hopefully one that would make it more democratic. And so Ethiopia was the third country I selected. But I also went to Hong Kong as well. And let me start with a few thoughts about Hong Kong. So I didn't include Hong Kong as a case study, for a variety of reasons. But I went there, and I went there right before. So I was there in 2019, like right before the kind of big wave of protests and revolution really started in the streets. So in some ways, my timing was unfortunate in that when I was there was a gloom of pessimism, and people were sort of saying, well, we're just going to have to accept kind of the nature of how Chinese encroaching repression from Beijing, how that was going to kind of go. And then people exploded on the streets, and for a minute there felt like there was a real pushback and a way to create some democratic space. Subsequently, what we found out, especially with the passage of a national security law last year, is that that was really an illusory moment, and that the crackdown in Hong Kong is even greater. So in a sense, it's gone full circle, and that we're back to where we started, where, or actually, I would say probably worse, in that any real vestige of one country, two systems when it comes to Hong Kong and China is more or less done. And so we're just seeing the fuller incorporation of Hong Kong into China's kind of repressive orbit. But at least when I was there, I was able to really have a chance to talk to a number of different people, including even a sitting legislator, to kind of Charles Mock, to really kind of ask and get a better sense of what are the dynamics at play when it comes to people and what they hope to do, and how these techniques are kind of working out. And for me, that really set the stage well then for kind of my next two country visits in that trip, the Thailand and the Philippines, where I was really kind of able to kind of launch off into those places. And one thing I'll also say is that just the preparation for these trips is really hard. It took me weeks, I would say months. First of all, you have to put together a list of the right people, and you want to make sure that when you actually go out to these places, especially if you're kind of if you're not living, in a context, that you'll have people to interview, that you'll be able to get to kind of fairly talk to a representative sample of different actors. So, I didn't want to make it a trip where I would go to Thailand and only speak to, the 4 digital rights activists that I could meet with, and that, I'd have no government access, no access to technology companies or other people who have really interesting things to say. But in order to kind of penetrate in and get, officers in the intelligence services, or high-ranking political officials in the Thai government to speak and meet with you, you got to have people vouch for you. You got to kind of constantly work contacts. Sometimes they'll just sort of drop off. Just when you think you're pinning down a meeting, you'll hear nothing. And so, I had to kind of secure and get a person to work with, like a handler on the ground who would kind of follow up on meetings. I had to have people on the ground through my network vouch for what I was going to do. I had to work out ahead of time, what were the ground rules going to be in terms of where we would meet, what I would say, how I could refer to these individuals. And then sometimes some people would want to, clear quotes. They would want to check and make sure that what I was saying wasn't going to lead to too much harm to them. And so, it really was like putting together a puzzle. And particularly in the Thailand context, which was both my first case study trip out, but also a place where there's a lot of fear. Right. I mean, there's a lot of, the ability to kind of speak freely. It's not something that comes naturally in Thailand. And when I was there was still a very delicate transition from a military junta into a quasi-elected government. And, people were very worried about what the authorities would monitor and see, what they were able to say, who they could meet with, and whether, things would really crack down. So, these case studies, all of them, but starting with Thailand, were very fraught, and they were high stakes for the individuals involved, both in terms of those who agreed to be interviewed, and also for me to make sure that I could actually access and get a clear picture, a comprehensive picture of what digital repression means on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, us Embassy Moscow alumni can appreciate that delicate line walking between, meeting with government and intel on one hand and dissidents and activists on the other. For our viewers, if they haven't looked into the Philippines, and especially the Maria Ressa case there, I think it is an excellent case study of freedom of speech and journalism. And you actually got to sit down with her for the book, correct?
Yeah, well, we actually did an online, we did a video chat for an hour. Yeah, so I don't even think she was in country at that point, but we did get to speak, and she her ideas, a lot of what she said helps frame a lot of important questions that I had. Because she is really interesting, in the sense that she is both someone who has decided that working with Facebook in particular, which is the main platform that people use in the Philippines, both in terms of communicating, but also how the government spreads its propaganda and its misinformation, disinformation. She has sort of decided that working with Facebook is more in the interest of journalists and civil society, despite the harms, the outcomes that occur, than just sort of walking away from it. And so she has this uneasy relationship where, on the one hand, she has struck up, like pretty strong contacts with very senior members of the firm, if not with Zuckerberg and himself. On the other hand, Facebook is used it has weaponized against her and other journalists like her, other opposition politicians, and so she keeps plugging away and trying, and it's a very difficult kind of balance for her. And she's very much in the middle of just kind of this dynamic where the government has found a way to weaponize and exploit social media to such an extent that it forms a key part of its governing strategy. Currently with Maria Ressa, it's very sad, but she's facing cyber libel and other assortment of other charges. And I think at this point she's appealing convictions. I don't know even, I believe she's maybe not in prison, but it seems like that may be something that is imminently in her future. And certainly there are many others, people like a sitting senator, Leila de Lima in the Philippines, who has been languishing in prison for 4 years, really on charges that are completely dubious. And so, this is the challenges are very real. It just kind of strikes me that so many people I talked to, Maria Ressa, Leila de Lima, who I emailed with, included some of her quotes in the book. Other people from places like even Ethiopia are in jail. So this is not an abstract thing, right? This is not like, there's digital repression and let's sit down and talk about what it means. The people I sat down with, many either have directly been persecuted, are facing ongoing incarceration, and their very lives at times are at significant risk.
Mm-hmm. I see a lot of misuse of the term Orwellian these days, especially on Twitter, but cyber libel sounds pretty Orwellian to me. And so you talked a lot about the Philippines and kind of the push-pull of the online community there, but you traveled to Ethiopia as well, which is now, awash with violence, especially in the Tigray region. Can you talk about kind of what's going through your head when you see that difficult news coming out of Ethiopia after visiting it for the book?
Yeah, well, Ethiopia is a country that I have, worked with, in the policy context for a long time. And it wasn't my first trip to Ethiopia. It was probably the country I had the greatest number of pre-existing contacts with to begin with. And so, going there for me was more part of a longer term, kind of interest in the politics of Ethiopia. And, and it was also interesting too, that I was able to kind of bring my trip together with Ethiopia in February of last year, like literally weeks before travel got shut down because of the pandemic. So, it really was touch and go in terms of whether, this chapter even would have been written. And I'm really grateful that I was able to kind of make it in before things got too difficult in terms of travel. And what was also kind of interesting is that when I went to Ethiopia in February of last year, things were certainly tense, and very much there was a very delicate scenario taking place in terms of, its nascent transition and its kind of move towards oncoming elections. But it was still kind of a moment, I think, where there was a lot of hope for the president of the country, President Abiy, who had not too long before that won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And, it felt like generally things were trending in the right direction. One of the places I actually ended up going to, and again, this was sort of fortuitous in terms of getting perspectives, was I went to Tigray. I went to Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, precisely where the violence and civil war is occurring in the northern part of the country. And it was very eye-opening to me, the messages coming out of Mekelle and the different TPLF leaders that I met with versus what I was hearing in Addis, in the capital of Ethiopia. Because there, even though war hadn't come yet, I went there, and I also went there at a very interesting moment. I was there on the 45th anniversary of the founding of the TPLF. So people were in a very boisterous, fiery sort of mood anyway. But it was, people were angry. They were very disparaging of Abiy's leadership. They were very much, sort of signaling that they were willing to kind of take things in their own path, that they would hold their own separate elections. They didn't need the central government, and that they felt very alienated from the political process. And so, I remember going back to the United States after, having that, and I was kind of emailing, communicating with a number of folks, both in government in the United States and elsewhere, and saying, like, look, I think if you think there's one place where polarization is really evident, and where there's a powder keg that could burst at any moment, Tigray in Ethiopia is it. And sadly, that proved to be true. And so by the fall of 2020 of last year, you saw major military operations commence, and now you have kind of an ongoing insurgency, humanitarian crisis, potential famine and food insecurity, and a broader crackdown that Abiy has pushed, both in Tigray and other areas where there's unrest, but even across the kind of broader political environment. And so you really kind of had a whiplash in terms of what was sort of like, I think, a hope that things would, while fragile, would gradually improve and liberalize, to now a point where I think there's a lot of pessimism in terms of what happens next and how, at a very minimum, can we stop the bloodshed in the crisis that's occurring in Ethiopia. So we're really at a crossroads, and it's one of those case studies that I continue to think a lot about, but in terms of what it represents and how things could have sort of gone off track in such a big way.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that these things, two populations living in two different realities, which I think sounds pretty familiar for us American political observers more and more these days. That dynamic can sometimes spill over into physical violence. I see a lot of that in my world, looking at Eastern Europe and the misinformation around the conflict in Ukraine as well. It can really blow up into that. Now, in the Ethiopian context, these tools of digital repression, or the platforms that kind of contribute to this two different information worlds, you wrote that some of this is imported from China, correct?
Yeah, well, so it's a kind of the China question is an interesting one globally, and it's also an interesting one in Ethiopia specifically. And, I think one of the questions I really tried to understand better is to get a better handle on what China's influence means. And so I certainly thought about it and asked a lot of questions in Ethiopia, and I found some surprising answers as a result of that. So at least in Ethiopia, I had anticipated that there would be a much greater Chinese influence when it came to kind of spreading digital repression techniques. And certainly Chinese companies have been involved in, building the initial ICT network, ZTE, and even putting in some nascent surveillance capabilities within that. But the fingerprints of the Chinese were not nearly as significant as other political factors and dynamics at play. So there's sort of two kind of insights I came up. One of which is that the Chinese are not operating alone in terms of providing advanced technology to Ethiopian, government for agents, intelligence officers, and so forth, when it comes to giving them tools to enact repression as they are wont to do. In fact, I spoke to several members of the intelligence that I included in the chapter, and they pinpointed how they had received spyware programs, capabilities from European firms, from the United States as an outgrowth of kind of war on terror, operations and so forth. They said, in fact, one of them has this really sort of eye-opening quote. He said, why are the Americans always so focused on the Chinese? There's so many other actors here that we deal with. We work with the Israelis, we work with the Europeans, and a lot of this has been verified by outside research outfits. So, on that score, I thought the kind of multifaceted nature of involvement from a variety of countries was really important. I think the second thing is that when you look at kind of specific dynamics, like let's look at, what's behind the grievances that the TPLF have, and what's the kind of personal animosity that is apparent when it comes to Abiy and the approach he's taking vis-a-vis the TPLF leadership and so forth. And that really has little to do with the Chinese at all. I mean, it really is something that relates to a lot of kind of, domestic factors when it comes to kind of the political evolution of the party system, Abiy's own role in that, which groups he has allegiances to, and other historical aspects. And so, to understand Ethiopia and why we're at this point right now, and how digital repression itself and some of those techniques have evolved, I think is a much more nuanced story.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Yeah, it's I think illuminative. We often, I think, in the search for a soundbite or a quick article or a quick paragraph, try and look to one single actor we can point to. And I've seen in our dialogue that often becomes China. I guess you can see that with this attempt to try and trace the origins of COVID-19 again. I thought the other day it'd be really nice and interesting to know, but like, what would that really change, vis-a-vis our response to the pandemic? But on the China issue, would you say that they are at the forefront of digital repression?
Yeah, well, they certainly. So, I mean, I don't want to underplay at all the significance of what China is doing and how they're sort of propagating and disseminating new ideas and new uses of technology that are really chilling in terms of their impact. So, one thing that another researcher has sort of put out as a kind of way to describe what China does, Maria Repnikova from Georgia State, is this notion of a parallel learning. So China is without question leading the world in a variety of uses when it comes to how they incorporate surveillance with the repressive state. They are using advanced techniques, facial recognition, incorporating that with big data analysis, even kind of, carrying out genomics and other types of surveillance. And, as many people know at this point, one area of China, Xinjiang province, is where so many of these issues are coming to bear, where they have created an absolute police state. They have incarcerated over 1 million ethnic Uyghurs. And, this has sort of become the laboratory of what digital repression could look like. I hate to use the term Orwellian, as you were talking about, because I think it's kind of overplayed. And yet, if there is one aspect, one place where, that notion is accurate, it would be in Xinjiang. And so in that sense, China's own modeling effect in terms of how it's treating its own citizens or people who live within, the country is something that many other dictators are aware of, look towards. On occasion, they approach the Chinese and they ask how they can acquire some of these capabilities, but it provides an ongoing kind of model for others to kind of look towards. So that's one thing, right? But I think also, there's really a normative battle playing out, especially on the global stage, where increasingly, at a very minimum, countries like China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, others, are making the case in international law and international forums that they have rights to determine their own sovereign uses of technology. What should be the rules when it comes to free expression? What should be the rules when it comes to regulating platforms or making decisions about surveillance? They say, look, we don't believe in kind of universal norms. We don't believe that human rights principles should extend to all citizens. Instead, we say country context matters, cultural context matters. And this goes against all the kind of bigger consensus that came out of World War II, the idea that, individuals, no matter what country they live in, have certain rights that they ought to have, and states have obligations to them, regardless of what system they're in. China and Russia are trying to overturn those basic concepts under the notion of cyber sovereignty, and basically saying, we decide, and our, United States and other liberal democracies, you don't understand the challenges and that we live under. And that's so dangerous. I mean, that really is just upturning the kind of very values in ideas, in norms that have been the basis of the international system for decades. And so that is another front where I think, it's not just digital, but digital is kind of the leading edge of where a lot of that is going. And I think we should all be alarmed about what those developments mean in terms of democracy, free expression, political organizing, mobilization, civil liberties, and so forth.
Yeah, the Model UN coach in me loves this conversation around a global compact or a global standard on these things. Do you think that is too far gone now? Or with
It's being chipped away at, but it's certainly. There are certain aspects that are enshrined as just fundamental in international law. Kind of notions of genocide and their definitional context and the obligations states have therein in terms of stopping the commission of genocide. The ICCPR, UN Declaration for Human Rights. These are not things that you can just sort of wish away overnight. So what we're seeing is a little more insidious, right? In that China isn't directly attacking the UN Declaration of Human Rights and saying, take this thing off the table completely. International law no longer applies. Instead, they're sort of carving out areas in the digital realm when it comes to how citizens can access the internet. They're saying this does, human rights doesn't make sense in this context, or you have to balance this right with the right for states to ensure public safety. Right? They play around with these contexts. These concepts. They manipulate them. They undermine them. And they use them in areas that have less settled law, like the emerging technology space, and then they exploit them. That's how they're sort of advancing their agenda.
Yeah, and it's almost the Wild West to innovate here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they're really, really aggressive on it, and they have, a lot of friends who see things the same way. I mean, you look at, you obviously have a lot of experience thinking about Russia, and these are concepts that very well fit in place in terms of Putin's needs, his political needs, in terms of how do you keep at bay, opposition movements that use YouTube and other platforms of that nature to disseminate very critical things that hundreds of millions of people in Russia and worldwide are able to watch and view when it comes to the corruption of the Russian state. To the extent that Putin can find a way and band together with others to make an argument to suppress the dissemination of those messages, that's to his advantage, and that's to many other dictators' advantage.
Yeah. Before we jump into that, I always get really excited about Russia. I'll just remind our audience, if you have any questions for Steven, please put those in the comments. We can get to that here in a bit. On the Russia issue, I find a really interesting contrast with the Chinese context, where when we're looking inward and domestically, Russian citizens have pretty open access to the internet, social media platforms, and global news media. My friends in Moscow all read the BBC every day, in Russian or in English. And in China, that's not necessarily the case. My friends in China always use VPNs and usually get around that. But what do you see as kind of that like compare and contrast, or the push-pull on the way that these two large prominent actors, Russia and China, go about this?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And actually, we have an ongoing project I'm involved with in Carnegie that is looking precisely at these issues. In fact, we just held a workshop earlier this week where we're trying to kind of get a better handle on what we see as the kind of growing digital authoritarianism that actually is occurring in Russia's space. Because I very much agree with you. I think there remains a lot more openness and ability to access Western platforms. But there also seems to be a larger trend of restrictions that are coming in place, whether it's through new legislation that's being passed, new means of internet controls that are being put in place in terms of capabilities, and even greater pressure being put on certain platforms like Twitter. And so, I hope that we don't sort of look back upon this conversation about the relative openness of Russia vis-a-vis China a year later and say, well, that was a nice thought, right?
Yeah.
But I will say there's a couple of reasons why, at least for now, Putin has constraints that China doesn't. I think for one, the Western platforms are popular and are used, have been used for a much longer period of time than what you saw comparatively in China. And so, China kind of put in controls early enough or disallowed certain platforms like Facebook to really get a foothold to begin with. And we're able to then develop kind of new domestic alternatives as a result. So that's why you have WeChat. That's why you have Weibo. That's why you have other types of platforms that are Chinese that will take down content based on what the Chinese state asks for. So there isn't, to that same degree, substitutes that Russian citizens will be happy to kind of move towards right away. That's one thing. Second, I mean, it's just a different kind of strategy. I think with Russia, there's always been kind of a real premium placed in terms of how do you manipulate information that's there. So not necessarily stop all information from occurring, at least in kind of the post-Soviet context, but instead, put out your narratives, manipulate those information, make people question what's true, what's false, make them so cynical that they just tune out completely. And that's worked really well. I mean, frankly, if that conforms with how political practice is, and it sort of seems to be keeping Putin and his cronies in power for an extended period, why work too hard to sort of put in place a mass surveillance system or a great firewall like China's that actually could backfire, that could lead to public backlash and take away the complacency that exists in Russia amongst many citizens towards something more fiery. So I think in that extent, Putin continues to have the upper hand, but until there's a real rationale, a logic to kind of moving full scale towards something that's much closer to the Chinese model, I think you'll see false starts, bits and pieces, but I don't think you'll see the wholesale shift.
Yeah. Putin has gotten pushback for trying to wall off the internet, even from his own inner circle as well. They kind of have a good idea what that backlash could be. I like to tell people that China really knows who it is and is confident in it, whereas Russia is not a democracy but likes to play one on TV. So it's kind of a different way of approaching things there. I've got a good question from Matt Hoyer here. He said, with these two main actors or the loudest voices in digital sovereignty, how do we resolve the differences on how we approach this? He says economic pressure doesn't seem to be palatable. Military engagement is too much.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we're going to resolve them in the short term, to be frank, because you're not going to be able to push the Chinese and to extent Russians and Iranians and others off this, off these positions, because these positions are integral to how these countries view their own national power in their interests. It's not as if, if you sort of are able to kind of outvote China in a number of multilateral forums, they'll just give up on cyber sovereignty. They're doing it anyway, right? Like the whole notion of, are we approaching a splinter net, or is it looking like we're sort of cut between a democratic internet and authoritarian internet? Like we're way past that conversation. We now have multiple different types of internets in different countries that are pretty contingent on the rules and regulations that governments have implemented. So if you look at India and Turkey or Uganda or Iran or Russia or China, each one has different rules in place that restrict to some extent, but also allow some openness to another extent. But to sort of claim that we have kind of a uniform, free, open, and interoperable internet along the lines of what you would see closer to in a country like the United States vis-a-vis India, it's just not reality. It's just not true anymore. And so to that extent, I think that the challenge is not how do we stop cyber sovereignty. The challenge is how do you mitigate it? How do you bring democracies together to push back and at least try to ensure that the core principles underlying free and open access to the internet are actually promoted. And I think to that extent, one of the ideas I've mentioned a lot is that democracies have to really kind of ask some tough questions about where are their differences when it comes to privacy, data protection, platform accountability, but how can we promote the commonalities that we also have? How can we promote a common set of values, even while we try to have to recognize that we need to work out different regulatory differences on privacy and other issues as well? And so I think that's something that, especially with the Biden administration, they're really aiming to do, because, I think otherwise we're going to find ourselves increasingly in a difficult place.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for that. I really like that as a punctuation mark on this kind of broader geopolitical conversation. I do want to spend the last bit of our time here on technology companies. This is another very complicated side of the coin, and specifically on disinformation and the spread of these different realities that different political camps can live in. Are the tech companies responsible for this?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good point, and actually, let me connect that question to a point I saw raised in the chat about Larry Diamond and sort of his shift from his perspective of kind of liberation tools, including the very private sector platforms that you mentioned, Chase, and how they have really shifted, and now we're in a situation where technology is kind of really bringing in these kind of Orwellian dynamics, and I think certainly, with Larry's perspective is one where I think he has sort of shifted his view pretty considerably when it comes to the threat that these technologies pose to democracies. Certainly as a starting point, I think he is very concerned with the influence of China and how its modeling is playing out across the world. But I also think that, kind of having all of us witnessed, how conspiracy theories, disinformation, false claims about the elections have proliferated in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of damage that's occurring at home as well. And so that kind of then leads to the question, well, is it the tech companies? Is it the platforms? Who is responsible ultimately? Now, I examined this question in the book in the Philippines chapter, and I even have a subheader that sort of says, is Facebook culpable for the digital repression that occurred in that context? And the answer is yes and no. On the one hand, I'm hesitant to ascribe agency to platforms when the actors like Duterte, the head of state there, are populists and they are exploiting populist narratives. And Facebook didn't tell them to do that. They are making their own decisions to build up large-scale disinformation machines to push out messaging that they know is false as a means to hold power. And I think that we have to make sure that we don't let them off the hook and simply blame algorithms for the diffusion of this bad information. Yeah. At the same time, if Facebook didn't exist, would Duterte have even been elected president? You could make a really strong argument, as many have done, that it was because of social media, because Duterte lacked campaign funds, he lacked access to kind of mainstream mass media outlets, that without having the power of social media behind him to power his campaign, maybe he wouldn't have been elected in office. And so, there's blame that kind of go around. And then certainly, when it comes to understanding the effect of amplification and algorithmic transparency when it comes to disseminating some of these worst messages, while things have improved a bit, certainly there's been so much harm that's resulted, whether it's, promulgation at home of domestic conspiracy theories, anti-vaccine campaigns, other kind of wild conspiracies when it comes to, politics and election fraud, or whether it's in a global context. And again, would they have spread to the degree as quickly as they would have without social media? Probably not. But, what's also interesting too, I think this just speaks to the difficulties of this, is that, pre-social media, there was a multi-decade effort and investment, certainly in the United States, to build up an alternative conservative information ecosystem that was powered by right-wing voices like Rush Limbaugh and others, that was amplified by Fox News and now more recently Newsmax, OMN, and that kind of sort of presents this like self-reinforcing circle. And if you actually look at this research that sort of says, how is disinformation spread amongst conservative circles in the United States? Oftentimes you'll get ideas that, either popular figures like Trump or people like Sean Hannity or others in kind of the conservative sphere will sort of raise on mass media. It then gets adopted and pushed out at an industrial level via social media platforms. And then some of that then gets re-picked up again by Tucker Carlson or others in the evening news. And so, you can't just sort of take social media and say, you're responsible, without looking at the ecosystem of how these different actors and how these other outlets, particularly traditional media outlets from radio to TV, how they all interact amongst one another. In other words, it's a very complex landscape, and it's not one where it's just social media by any means responsible for spreading these harmful messages.
Yeah. So it didn't build the engine, so to speak, but it added a lot of grease to it, right?
I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, Chase, like, you've thought a lot about these issues. I mean, we see it, unfortunately, spread in a lot of circles in Idaho, when it comes to election falsehoods and so forth. And, certainly it's, a lot of it comes through Facebook groups, through Reddit threads, other sorts of things. But, look at conservative talk radio. Look at look what's on, conservative media in terms of the TV. I mean, some of the studies that are coming just in the past few days alone, in terms of like, I think it was something like a quarter of viewers of OMN and Newsmax now sort of believe that QAnon is sort of the believe in the basic tenets of QAnon. I saw some kind of survey result from that. Maybe you know the specifics of that better, but I mean, this is shocking to me in terms of how these ideas are spreading in ways that are extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Yeah, I've been kind of thinking about and wanting to write about this for a bit, and because especially when I was your student in grad classes at Boise State, I talked a lot about the 2016 election and the misinformation, some of which was driven by a malign foreign actor, Russia, and its cyber cutouts. But it almost seemed like in 2020 they didn't need to. That they had, it was nothing pre-baked in the system. It was just, our own feedback loops and that mechanism you just talked about, but, put on supercharge.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, look, the 2020 election is not about foreign interference. That is not the lesson of that in any way. In fact, in some ways, that's sort of like, it's one of those issues that ended up being distracting, as people said, how do we stop Russian bots and trolls from going in and manipulating our understandings? And it was us the whole time in 2020, starting with the former president and the lies that were being peddled from the White House. I mean, it was, and the thing is, we saw it happen in slow motion 6 months before we even had an election, where already the groundwork was being laid for false claims about mail-in ballots and voter fraud, none of which has ever been proven. It's an environment, this sort of like the epistemic challenge of what we're looking at, where knowledge and science and evidence and facts are things to kind of be played around with and manipulated rather than sort of argued from, at least on the basis of what they represent. It's a whole new struggle that we're in, and we're all trying to figure out what it means and how to deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, I jump up and down in debates about this all the time. And I always say it doesn't matter if the call is coming from outside or inside the house. It's like people are still picking it up and listening to it, and
right.
And
it really, I think, raises the question that people ask all the time: what do we do when it comes to how do you stop these trends? How do you stop digital repression? What are the ways to kind of approach it? And my answer is that you have to do two things at once, right? One is we have to figure out how to restore and build resilience to our democracy at home. If we can't figure out a way to effectively address these fundamental questions when it comes to our information integrity and the strength of our democratic discourse, and how to grapple with polarization at home, we're not going to be a very good, effective messenger abroad in terms of spreading and pushing out democratic values. So we've got to on the one hand really ask some tough questions and grapple with how we fix our politics here. But we also can't afford to wait either and just sort of say, look, we're going to take a time out for 8 years until we kind of get our politics in order, assuming that we are able to do that. And in the meantime, allow kind of Russia and China to kind of run roughshod, and other, mini autocrats and dictators, kind of just spread a liberalism. And then we kind of wake up and say, all right, now we've kind of figured it out. And at that point, we've sort of, the struggle has already kind of moved on. Mm-hmm. So we have to work together with our democratic allies and really confront these problems abroad, and work with citizens and activist groups and digital rights campaigners and opposition members to really push back. While at the same time, we can't afford to kind of not scrutinize our own conduct and try to put in place the kind of reforms that are necessary so we can get past some of what I view with 2020 to be a real low point in our recent democratic history.
Yeah, I love any plug we can make for better civics education here and around the world. And, it's the reason why I'll put it up on the screen here. At the Frank Church Institute, we ask the question, how do democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century? I think that's a really critical question, and it's complicated and takes a long time to answer, and we may never fully answer it, but it's still important to discuss it. So while I still have you for about 5 or 7 more minutes here, I'll push you a little bit. What is, the horizon or just beyond the horizon look like for digital repression? Where is this going next?
Yeah. No, well, this is really, it's a good question for us to sort of end this, or talk about in this final segment, which is that, I don't think it's a one-way street. I don't think authoritarian governments or illiberal forces, whether they're government or otherwise, have a monopoly in terms of how they're able to exploit these technologies for their political advantage. I do think that that there are there's a lot of innovation that's happening. There are a lot of good aspects that are occurring. One of the things I'll point to, for example, is the fact that we really are at a moment of much more transparency and accountability than we've ever seen before, in terms of governments and bad actors not being able to get away with things in the same way. And if you look at the way that groups like Bellingcat or some of the digital labs associated with Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch have been able to expose abuses, whether it's Alexei Navalny's poisoning recently, the Skripal poisonings prior to the downing of Malaysian Airlines, over Ukrainian airspace, things along these lines that, 2 decades ago, we would have said, well, we think it's the Russians are involved, but we can't prove it, and we'll just have to kind of move along with the assumption that they've been involved. Instead, now through open source intelligence, through other really interesting digital forensic techniques, we can show exactly what happened. And it's much harder for dictators like Putin or Xi Jinping or others to hide. When you see satellite imagery that's disseminated worldwide about mass internment camps in Xinjiang, when you're able to splice together footage of atrocities that occurred in Sudan and Iran after they cut the internet because they thought they could get away with shooting citizens, but then didn't realize that people would still take video footage in their smartphones and would smuggle out that footage, and that would then get publicized and even lead to the fall of a regime in Sudan, that makes a difference. And so, I do think we cannot underestimate the adaptive capability of citizens around the world to look and stare these obstacles in the face and find innovative ways to push back, to resist, and to hopefully bring about better governance in some of the countries that we've been discussing. So in other words, we're not at the end of history. We're not at the end of the road at all when it comes to the effect of emerging technology and what it means for democracies or democratic movements. We're in a period right now of struggle, of difficulty. And certainly, the trend lines today are not good. We're witnessing an autocratic resurgence around the world. And that's something that democracies overall have to really think hard about and think about ways that they can help push back. But I do have confidence that, some of this is cyclical, and that, there will be new ways that citizens and groups will mobilize and innovate to find solutions to these tough political problems.
Yeah, I really love that idea of holding the mirror up. And, in the country where I've spent the most time, in the Republic of Georgia, that has really helped the most bring about political change and anti-corruption there, both digitally and in person on the streets. Is the activists are really our greatest asset going forward. And so I guess let's end with this. If there's any activists who might be watching this now or later, what are some good resources they can use to be good digital actors?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of groups out there that are doing great things. And when it comes to sort of digital rights groups, you have your traditional ones, your Human Rights Watch, your Freedom House, Amnesty, and so forth. But other groups like Access Now, Access Now actually sponsors one of the leading kind of digital rights conferences around the world called RightsCon that will take place in early June. I'm organizing a panel there, but there are hundreds of sessions where digital rights activists come together to do precisely what we're talking about here: talk through problems, look for solutions, look for innovative and creative ways to push back. So certainly that's something that a lot of people know about in the community, and if not, I would sort of advise them to attend. It's virtual this year, and so the barrier to entry is pretty low. But there's many other ways as well. Connect with your independent journalists, whether they're online like Rappler and Maria Ressa, or whether they're more traditional outlets. There are a variety of different actors who are fighting for the cause for democracy around the world, and it's important to kind of keep up hope and to know that there are a lot of these governments are a lot more brittle than they would appear. When you look at things like what happened in Belarus and Lukashenko diverting the plane and arresting the opposition activist because who was responsible for leading the Nexta Telegram channel. Is that strength or is that weakness? I would say that's someone who's desperate to show strength and maintain power, and who recognizes that the population is turning against him, and whose days, may not be numbered in terms of a change tomorrow, but there is a limit, and eventually, I think we'll see a change in Belarus, and we'll see a change in other places where repression has managed to sort of maintain its power. I think we'll continue to see fluctuations in that regard. No one expected Egypt to fall the way it did in Arab Spring, and while you get setbacks, subsequently there, in other places like Tunisia, you actually can see democracies flourish, and I think we have to really kind of keep that in mind when it comes to this to the landscape.
Yeah, you always do a great job at chipping away at my pessimism, so thank you for that. Well, I think we'll go ahead and let you go here soon. Thank you so much for joining us for this final session of Fridays with Frank. And would love to host you out here on the Oregon coast. I got to introduce you to fat tiring biking on the sand. So, yeah,
that sounds great. I love it. But in the meantime, thanks for having me. It's great to stay connected and to be a part of the Boise State community, and hopefully in person in the coming months.
Yeah, here's hoping. All right, well, thank you, Steve. I'm going to go ahead and kick it back to Gary for some closing remarks.
Our thanks to Steve Feldstein and Chase Johnson for this timely discussion. Both Steve and Chase are members of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, so we appreciate their time and effort here. For our viewers, if you appreciate these sessions on Fridays with Frank, please go to the Frank Church Institute website and make a contribution. Thank you.